All right. So, would you like to know more of kind of, we'll call it an insider's perspective to how things work at Amazon, how to better manage your relationship with Amazon, and just strategic and tactical ways to grow your business that maybe you hadn't necessarily thought about before? So, to have that discussion, I am super excited and honored to bring on Stan Friedlander, who is a former insider at Amazon, and he had a title at one point as high as president. Is that a fair statement? Maybe not the
Well,
president of Amazon.
no, I certainly wouldn't say that. When I moved to Japan, ran the apparel business there. There's a certain sort of hierarchy of how you want to call yourself on your card, on your business card, and director of apparel. So internally, my title is director of apparel, jewelry, and watches, customer experience, various other things that reported into me. But I ran the P&L for a few different categories, and my team said that you would want to have a better title than just director of apparel. So I left it to them, and the direct translation was president of apparel. It's sort of like saying the boss.
Right, right, right,
Uh,
right.
so but I have to trust that that's essentially what was on my card, because I have to freely admit I could not read or speak Japanese.
Right. But the interesting thing is just we'll get um, into your background here in just a moment. But I mean, you had a very bird's eye perspective of how things are going at Amazon and interactions with like the highest of high people at Amazon at the time. So, which we'll get into all of that, which I think just makes for an interesting discussion, just for people to understand how Amazon works and what goes on in the background. But before we get into your background, just so everyone has a little context, you and I shared the stage, so to speak, at Prosper Show, which is the biggest convention for Amazon sellers. As we record this in April of 2022, uh, our session on a panel discussion on international selling was just last month. So in almost a month to the day, just a little bit
Yep.
more than a month. So it was super interesting hearing your perspective because everyone else on the stage was a seller. So like third party seller. Now you're no longer at Amazon, but you were there for 10 and a half years. Is that?
Correct. Correct.
Do you mind just giving us kind of a whirlwind tour of what you did at Amazon while you were there?
Sure. So my background sort of like two parts. I worked in physical brick and mortar at Macy's for over a decade, and then I worked at Amazon for over a decade, so completely online. When I started at Amazon, I ran the apparel 1P business back in mid 2008. I then did that for about 3.5 years. Let's just say we grew the business substantially, more than double every year.
Oh, wow.
And I moved to run the footwear business, no pun intended. And yes, I've said that before. To run the footwear business in early 2012. I sort of responsible for shutting down endless.com. That was actually the first thing I did. Which was a site that Amazon created to both learn on how to sell apparel and footwear, mostly footwear, but also to compete with Zappos, which Amazon ended up purchasing. So it made Endless sort of irrelevant. I launched in inventory sharing, image sharing, launched Zappos as a third-party seller on Amazon. Did that for about 4 years. I ran the full P&L for footwear and moved to Japan to do sort of the same thing of how to make the fashion business profitable, which was somewhat difficult for Amazon in many ways. So I moved to Tokyo and ran the apparel, jewelry, and watch business for Amazon. But I don't speak Japanese, so that was a fascinating experience. About half my team could not speak with me, had to either use translators, which we did not tend to hire, or my own team, which leads to sort of how do you learn to trust folks that don't know you, don't speak the language, and there was no one on my team that English was a primary language. So it was an interesting experience, fascinating. and I highly recommend it to almost anybody, just maybe not at my age. And I ended up leaving Amazon when I moved back to the States in late 2018. So I've been at Amazon 10 and a half years, and I've been operating as an independent consultant ever since. I help brands and sellers with their e-commerce strategy, anything from digital marketing, top line, logistics, organizational structure, all the way down to how to deal with Amazon. So in other words, there could be a big, hairy problem, and I may help out with that as well. So one or the other, big, hairy or top line strategy.
Got it. So you're kind of dealing with the carrots and the sticks. The carrots of helping people, grow, but then also when the sticks come up, how do you, meaning the less pleasant things that sometimes happen in business, how do you navigate that? So let's start
That's
with
right.
maybe the carrot side of that. So you mentioned some of the businesses that you were overseeing were doubling year over year growth. Now that alone is a challenge that I think is hard to overcome. So how do you manage growth? Like that's just maybe just a simple question to start off with.
Well, I would say that especially at that time in 2008, which still Amazon was already in business 13, 14 years by that point. Even if I'm pretty sure they hadn't reported a profit until 2009 from a public standpoint. What I would say is that fairly early on, just after I started, it was pretty clear that Jeff B was pretty intent on growing two particular businesses, and this is grocery and apparel. And main reason being is that both businesses showed fairly high total market segment size. So say 300, $400 billion US worldwide or US, and very low percentage done online. I think it's pretty safe to say when I started, apparel and footwear was in the single digits as a percent that was done online. And grocery was even probably slightly smaller. And when I say single digits, I don't mean like 9 or 10. I mean like 3 to 5.
Right.
And the viewpoint, no matter what the product segment is that why can't you be number one? And not so much number one online, that's sort of assumed. And it's more a matter of why not number one in total? If books can do it, if electronics can do it, if toys can do it, having been a very tenured apparel person, I have to admit that struck me as interesting to me. But at the same time, resourcing for the particular categories. In other words, once Amazon says, we got to get this, it's not to say that the floodgates are off and we never had to explain ourselves. That's absolutely not true. But it does mean that the ability to go fund, if you're at X amount of millions and you're going to be 2x, 3x, 4x that in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 10x, 20, 30, 40x, in say 4 years. Then how do you fund that today? And so you can also look at that as from a standpoint of when I started, I think we had about 16 to 18 fulfillment centers in 2008. Now they have around 140 to 150. That doesn't even include the small sort centers that deal with last mile or grocery. And we're talking buildings that are 500,000 to 1 million square feet.
Huge buildings.
And so the idea of, okay, Amazon was doing 18 billion US in 2008 and growing at a rate of about 30% per year. And interestingly, take away COVID, they grew at the same rate pretty much indefinitely. I've never seen in my entire career, even historically, we've not seen that. Walmart didn't do that.
Right.
And to show this sort of continuous growth without a sort of plateauing. And maybe that plateauing would have started to happen to a certain extent if COVID didn't happen. And that's a different topic altogether. But the way Amazon looks at things is how do you look 3 to 5 years or even further out and build for that today? What is your customer going to want in 3 to 5, 10 years and build for that today? And if we're going to take big bets, how do we resource that today? And that's always what I found interesting, because I didn't work in that environment. Macy's was not, Macy's was a quarterly sort of, how do we make sure we hit margin this quarter?
Right.
That absolutely does not exist at Amazon. I'm not there anymore, but I mean, that has never entered into my frame of thought at Amazon. It certainly did when I was at Macy's. And that just gives you a sense of, here you have 100, and, I think Macy's is now over 150 years old and 160, fairly successful brick and mortar chain, right?
Yeah.
Probably one of the more successful on the department store side. And yet, thinking 10 years out, I can't say I ever had a single discussion that was more than 3 to 5 years. And even those discussions were infrequent. Whereas at Amazon, one of the first projects I worked on after being hired was, can you build a 10-year plan?
Wow.
And I said, my current plan for the rest of this year through next year is to more than double. In other words, I don't even know how to comprehend, I could be missing plan and be plus 135% in a given week.
Mm-hmm.
How do I comprehend where, a starting point? And they said, well, what do you think your starting point should be? And I remember we had this discussion back and forth, and it was, well, how do you get to number one online and offline in 10 years?
Wow.
Which I thought was sort of insane. And then, okay, fine, but it wasn't just throw some numbers on a piece of paper and how do you get there? I mean, that sort of was part of the process.
Right.
But it was also, what would you need? What sort of, I'm thinking of, like, are we starting to teleport thing? How do you have sort of, what sort of technology? I'd never worked in a tech company in my career, and I'm not a coder. I don't know how to, so what sort of things would you need? But it's that sort of thinking 10 years out, and what would you need to be number one? I said, well, first of all, we'd have to offer free returns, period. We'd have to show, we absolutely have to shoot on figure. We look like idiots right now. So I'm thinking in terms of just apparel. So I know that's fairly specific, but the point being is that, Amazon was one of the first. I know Zappos was also around the same time starting to offer free returns, and people thought they were insane. There's no way they can ever have a path to profitability. And if we could show a path to profitability, fine, turn it on. That's the sort of thinking. And okay, what's the path to profitability? Well, we'd have to be a certain size. Well, what would that require you to grow by? And I say it's sort of chicken and egg. If we don't offer it, we'll never get that big. And as soon as Bezos hears things like that, that's the sort of thing that would really go. I mean, he may say also, we'll go prove it.
Right.
I'm not denying that, but okay, if you go prove that with customer data and surveys and showing that people is acceptance of buying something online if they can't return it, or if they have to pay for the return, they don't know how it's going to fit. Again, I'm speaking about a particular product set, but his appetite for just saying turn it on, go fund it, lose money for a while, not indefinitely.
Right.
And you have to show this sort of cash flow positive at some point. Although when I moved to Japan, quite frankly, apparel was yet to be cash flow positive, and they'd already been open 13, 14 years, wow. Which is one of the reasons why I moved there. But so it shows you as to sort of how they're sort of thinking on. You don't need to show that it's profitable by next quarter. And you do have to show that it's profitable by some point. And profit also doesn't necessarily have to be net income. It could be a lifetime value of a consumer. If you build the biggest diaper category and get mom to be a customer, and then mom is a high lifetime value, even if diapers loses money. So we might look at things from a lifetime value of a particular product set.
So you're looking beyond just what they're buying in apparel, but like if apparel can open the door to new customers, bring them in and they buy a couch or a TV in 5 years, that helps the lifetime value. Am I understanding that right?
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely. And
wow.
certain categories have a higher lifetime value than
Sure,
others.
sure.
Interestingly, books is not necessarily one of the highest. And interestingly, baby and apparel, footwear, things that you might buy for other people, uh, to have a higher lifetime value. Things that might be a bigger pain, I won't say it, but to deal with,
Hmm.
either from a return or a serviceability standpoint, which is another thing altogether that Amazon isn't necessarily the greatest at. From a like furniture, you have to put it together.
Right, right, right.
Um, home maintenance, but where they are good, meaning dealing with the return or customer service, might just say, "We'll solve your problem." Then that has a higher lifetime value because the customer is likely, I'll just deal with them. Picture, subscribe, and say, just turn diapers on, get it
Yeah,
once a
it
week.
just happens.
And
It's reliable, it's consistent.
right, dog food, you know.
Yep.
So those sort of things, can have a higher lifetime.
Okay, got it. So Amazon's looking at things from a different lens than most of the corporate world is. To your point, having worked in a couple of Fortune 500 companies myself, everything tends to be in about a quarter at the most. Sometimes you are starting to look into like the next year, maybe a couple years down the road, but it's not 10 years, these 10-year
Yeah.
plans. So,
In all fairness, I mean, to that 10-year comment, I never built another 10-year plan.
oh, gotcha, gotcha.
So
Once it's there, it's
that's
there.
yeah. I mean, the funny thing is how accurate that 10-year plan ended up being, and
Huh.
I still have it to this day. But I never did another. I haven't done other things, although we would have discussions on, if you kept growing at the same rate for another 5 years, when are you hitting 100% of capacity? And so you think in terms of, when do you need a larger return center? So
Mm.
Amazon actually, I mean, apparel, footwear, and whatnot, there's a dedicated return center in the center of the country, Louisville area. And how do you think that through of when would you need a second one? To the best of my knowledge, they have a second one, but they use more of the network at this point. But like when I moved to Japan, all of apparel and footwear was shipping out of one fulfillment center, and we were bursting. And how do we separate the image studio from that fulfillment center, build a second fulfillment center? And do we even need that today? Well, we may not need it today, but we're going to need it in 3 to 5 years.
Uh-huh.
You have to start thinking of like, why not build it now?
Right.
And what is the probability that suddenly your sales are going to go flat and you wouldn't have ever needed that second facility? And so you kind of go through all of those sorts of parameters, but that's how Amazon thinks when it's building out its capacity or its logistics or its technological, what sort of things would we need to get from, to get from 2 to 3 business days to 2 and never having to say 3, or to 1 and never having to say 2, or in
Mm.
Japan, same day, what does the second fulfillment center in my particular category get me from a same day coverage? All of these things, and what does that mean from a conversion standpoint? And is
Interesting.
that worth it? Yeah, and that's how we would evaluate whether to build this building or not.
Got it. And a lot of it is based on hypotheticals of continuous growth and growth that might not even be profitable yet, but
That's right.
down the road. So it's just this kind of long-term thinking. Now, I know that now you help e-commerce owners with figure out some of this long-term thinking. So bringing it down to scale to someone who's, maybe at a certain level today, and they want to 10x over the next however many years, what advice would you give to them?
I start with saying, please understand my bias. And my bias is that I came from a place for 10 years that built most everything in house or bought someone.
Hmm.
So, in other words, control of whatever, and really it's the customer experience, like controlling whatever touches the customer on backward. That's how I think.
Right.
That's also how I would think for most anybody else, especially if you want to grow.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to start with that premise of saying I'm fairly biased to saying you should be mostly in-house. How do you have control over most everything that you have? Because if you're contracting out, and I'm a contractor, but if you're contracting out for most things, your control over that customer experience starts waning. And so how do you maintain as much control, let alone at a certain point, it becomes cost efficient to have things in-house. And that can vary by type of product that you're selling, the types of, and how much you're distributed to other, whether it's Amazon 100%, that's typically hand in hand with my first advice is you should diversify. And how distributed are you? If you're only distributed to a couple of folks and you're $50 million, let's say, I start saying it would seem to me you should be able to do most everything in-house. And these marketing solutions, logistics solutions, and all of these sorts of things, I would figure out how you learn how to do this in-house. But if you're distributed to, say, 300 retailers, both physical brick and mortar and online, even getting to 100 million, you may have a hard time justifying, that break even of where doing everything in-house may be a larger dollar amount, depending on how complicated your situation is and how much have you already taken in-house. If you've always built yourself on, finding the next best solution, but it's external, and you've grown to 100 million, taking it in-house is actually that much more expensive than if you had done it early on. Admittedly, that's sort of the Amazon philosophy, is almost always do everything in-house. Because if you build to scale and you always do it in-house, longer term, it was always cheaper for you to do it that way.
Okay, interesting. And what's interesting about that is for most of us, there's kind of a conflict or cognitive dissonance there because, a lot of the logistics and customer service is handled by Amazon because most sellers listening to this would be using FBA. So where would be some of the things, like, let's say someone was at $1 million in sales and they're looking to get to 10, what might be some things you would suggest to them in that progression to start bringing in-house or not offload or to diversify? Or I'll let you kind of go with what are the things you would suggest?
Yeah, it does depend on what are they selling and where do they want to go and how complicated, what do they really want to take on. But let's just use the 1 to 10. I am going to want to understand your level of, and I'm assuming you're 100% on Amazon. Let's just say, because that's what I've predominantly, that's what I've seen. I will want you to prove to me your savviness with digital marketing and search optimization, not just from a standpoint of you hired XYZ, consulting or marketing agency, but what is your understanding of what that agency is even doing for you? Or do you even have an agency? And if you're doing it all in-house already, what is your own savviness with regard to any of this? So in other words, I'm trying to learn about you maybe just as much as you're trying to learn from me as to how can I help you? Because there are people that are very savvy about it, and they may have just started. And if they have just started and come across as though they very much understand sponsored bidding and building out a detailed page, understand A+, and how to build all these things, I'm not going to necessarily say, go hire the so-and-so. I may say, where are you getting your data? And if they haven't necessarily hired outside yet for data, I probably will start there.
I also hiring somebody to in-house to focus on data?
No, I mean to go purchase data, search ranking data and whatnot that Amazon doesn't necessarily supply in the best way.
Okay.
You can get it from other folks that is actually just equally as accurate and um, arguably more useful, and the way it's put together for you is easier to read and digest than the way Amazon necessarily presents it.
May I
Especially
ask who you might suggest for data?
Celix and Helium 10,
Okay.
for the most part. I have some with Jungle Scout, and I, have personal opinions about most of these. I would say Celix and Helium 10
Okay.
seem to work best for most of my
Got it.
clients.
So those are two solutions that you would recommend. Okay. Just
Mm-hmm.
from like what you've seen with how they present the data and accuracy and all that. Okay.
Does it
Um,
mean that you need someone internally that knows how to use this data? Yes. Just because you can read this and say, oh, this is the sixth best term to bid on based on who's bidding on it so far and whatnot. But does that owner even know how to go enter things into Seller Central and actually go bid? I'll be honest with you. If you're hiring me to do that, that's I won't let you. I mean, like, I don't know how to do that, even though
right.
I advise people how to, this is what you should be doing. I can't actually enter a new item setup. I can't actually uh, do dialing up and dialing down of bids within a Seller Central account. In fact, I actually developed a new item setup for apparel and footwear, but for the most part, you would never want me actually entering anything. So what I mean by that is that just because someone can read this data doesn't necessarily mean that they're also the right person to make sure it's actually taking place within their Seller Central account. That too, I've found that's part of what I work on,
Mhm.
is just assuming that you have the best people on your team. That doesn't necessarily always happen.
Okay.
Um, you need to audit the auditors, as that's actually a phrase from
Well,
Amazon.
that makes a lot of sense. And touching back on your earlier experience, you were in Japan and you didn't speak Japanese, and you said half your team didn't speak Japanese. So, and none of them were necessarily English as a first language, right?
That's correct.
So you had to develop systems to understand that. So it's a little bit more data driven systems and not just probably
Well,
like, oh, I like this person, which I think a lot of us kind of default to. So how do you develop systems to make sure you got the right person on the right seat of the bus, so to speak?
um, well, that's an interesting one. I would say that numbers is sort of universal.
Uh-huh.
So in other words, I can certainly read any deck that's created. I might have a certain weekly business review, a WBR deck that I want to see. It doesn't mean, I moved over to Japan and within a week I'm saying, here's the deck I've been using for the last several years. Please convert to this now. No,
Mhm.
that's not what I did. But what I will do is ask a lot of questions around anomalies in numbers. That's the same thing I would do when I'm if I'm first dealing with a client, I want to see everything related to whatever I'm supposed to be working on, whether it's top line or a big hairy problem that's a very detailed issue. I'm going to want to read whatever you have related to that problem. And I admit sometimes you may not have a lot. And, so say when I moved to Japan, I will actually, my issue in Japan was that we had a ton. In fact, we had too much, so that we were reading through tons of data every week, but we weren't acting on anything in particular. And so what I would say to that is that be careful what you wish for. I mean, Amazon has access to more data than pretty much any company.
Oh yeah.
And so, especially in a color size business, you have to be very careful as to what level of detail you're looking at, how often you're looking at it, and ask yourself the question, what am I doing with this? And when was the last time I actually acted on something from this particular data point? And if your answer is sort of a blank stare, then why are we even looking at it? And be okay to get rid of a data point
Yeah.
and focus on the ones that, which ones do you tend to work off of? which ones, if they go up or down on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis, or however often you're looking at things. I mean, we tend to do it weekly. How often are you actually doing something about it? And that's where I would say the same thing applies to a new client, is that well, what are you looking at today? And have you thought about, and I might have a list of different things that you might want to look at. And by the way, this is the way, if you want to get in sort of in bed with how Amazon looks at it, I'm going to give you a few data points of this is what Amazon is looking at. And Amazon's going to care about selection, price, and the customer experience overall more than anything else. And if you're out of stock, or if your reviews, even if your average review is 4.4, let's say, but it's very distorted that they're either 5 stars or 10% of the time it's 1 star, that's a problem. You have some very pissed off people. And what are you doing? So I'm just giving you some things of what you should be looking at on a sort of weekly or however long basis, is you should be, as a seller, you should absolutely be reading all your 1 and 2 star reviews and bucketing what seems to be coming out of those, and then doing something about it. Just, oh yeah, we seem to have a problem with, we say it's green and in reality it's sage, and that seems to bother people. In other words, did I describe anything that you changed? Right. What are you actually doing to change it? And you as the owner, you say, yeah, my team's looking at that. That's a crap response.
Right, exactly. What
so
is your team doing about it? And
exactly. Is, so that's a very Amazon thing to do, is not ask you how your weekend was, but so we just came in, our pricing metrics, this isn't as common today, given price matching is so prevalent, but our pricing metrics might say that our lost buy box was 2% of the time, which means that a third-party seller, I'm talking about 1P, a third-party seller might be winning the buy box 2% of the time where there's crossover with a 1P offer. First question would be, is if we price match immediately, well, how can that happen? Nowadays that probably wouldn't happen, but 5, 7, 10 years ago it still would. And so you might have to answer to that. Today's problems would be more along the lines of a customer complaint rate, a counterfeit complaint rate, fast track in stock, which means fast track in stock is just how many glance views are going to something where Amazon owns the item or Amazon has the item in its building. And as a category leader, I didn't necessarily care between 1P or 3P. That doesn't necessarily mean everybody at Amazon has that same belief, but most executive levels don't care. So I just care that I can ship it out to you in 1 or 2 business days, that I can make that promise and I can make it happen. I might want to follow up. How often is that happening? And is it not happening on certain items more so than others? I might care about return rates. And are the return rates higher for certain brands versus others, especially in apparel?
Right.
So those are the types of metrics that I might look at. And depending on, who I'm speaking with, if you're selling a small electric item, or a health supplement, a sporting goods item, return rates are usually pretty low. If they're not, I would hope that you've already looked at this. But if by the time you're talking to me, your return rates are still single digits or higher, high single digits or higher, that's a problem. When the balance of Amazon is 2 or 3%, say for sort of a non-apparel, non-footwear based item, are fairly low return rates. Reviews, again, anything in the low 4s and certainly anything in the 3s, you should be looking at, and you should try to understand why and how is this happening. Especially if you sell on other sites, and your reviews are higher. I would care a great deal about that. And how is that happening? And we all know that there, as much as Amazon wants to act like there's no review manipulation, we all know that that's not true. So, what are you doing to make sure that you're not necessarily being attacked? A lot of people are
Sure.
surprised when I say that to them. Actually, even though there's many sellers that we see at various shows, and they all tend to act like, oh yeah, there's most sellers actually aren't even aware that that can happen. I said, well, that's why you may want to read your 1 and 2 star reviews, and make sure, verify, does it seem right?
Well, that I think leads us to a interesting discussion is when you need to bring Amazon into the fold and communicate things. So I think what you just brought up there about, sometimes you do get these reviews that like they're clearly probably there might be 3 or 4 that almost say verbatim the same thing. And it's
Mhm.
almost too convenient. Like sometimes there's like
Right.
too many variables and like they're
Yep.
just trying to hit like certain key phrases to set the algorithm off against you. And I think we've all
Well,
probably experienced that to some point, whether it's a competitor or some sort of dirty actor on the
yep.
platform. That stuff does happen. And sometimes you have to communicate that to Amazon. Now you put it in
Yep.
a support case, you might not even be dealing with an Amazon employee, and you're trying to explain a situation to someone who has no idea what you're even trying to communicate. How, and this could be a wider discussion on seller support. How do you manage that relationship and that communication?
Well, it does depend on how large you are, and do you have sellers, like, do you have an account manager? And I know many sellers do not, but some do.
Mhm.
I have differing opinions as to whether that's useful or not. I tend to say if you're quite large, even if you've had bad results or whatnot in the past, I would still say having an email contact of some kind is worthwhile, even if the person tends to turn over fairly often, and that sort of thing. But having that a separate email you can go through is worthwhile. Yes, this is where people sometimes use me, but I wouldn't say that I'm the first line of defense. Is you see a few bad reviews, go hire me? No, I would argue, no offense, I'm probably too expensive, and likely I'm not going to find anything just because of that. But if you file a case and you start digging into this and you're finding, you found 2 or 3, 4 or 5 reviews, to your point, that had almost verbatim the same exact content, and let's say you even received a weird communication either back from Amazon or say separately, from someone telling you not to do that anymore. Which, yes, I have run into this multiple times. So don't think that you don't have competitors that aren't essentially willing to attack. That does go
So
on.
wait. Go back to the telling you not to do this anymore. Is somebody at Amazon telling you not to do this anymore, or you just
No.
randomly get a random email from someone saying, "Don't mess with
Yes.
this."
Yes.
Really?
Yes. That's how people find me, quite
Huh.
frankly, is this does go on. And at that point, if you ever have that, I would say you need to get help.
Right.
There are I obviously I'm not the only person doing this, but is getting help to how to navigate this problem. And the reason why I say that is, don't assume that the case you filed, clearly something happened with that. And as much as Amazon wants to say it has complete control over any internal fraud, that's bullshit. There's no way that they can. So yeah, and let's not kid ourselves. How much Amazon is paying someone that's based in Costa Rica, or some small town somewhere outside the U.S. That person can easily be fairly easily be paid off. Not to
Hmm.
say that that's rampant. I'm just saying is that it can happen. Okay. If and when you ever receive a communication you don't understand, that's where I would start asking around, asking the other sellers, people people you've met at Prosper, or people asking around, have you ever experienced this? And and either finding someone like me or whatnot to dive into that. What are you actually going through? And assuming that Amazon is necessarily going to solve that via you turning in a case, no, not necessarily. And the reason being is that Amazon typically does not want to take down reviews. It typically
Yeah, they
does
seem very
not.
protective of that.
That's right. And I respect
Right.
free speech and whatnot. It was a verified purchase. How hard is it to buy 3 toasters and put a negative comment in if I'm a competitor of toasters? Not that hard.
Right.
And I was a verified purchase. Now, is it possible that Amazon could tie all 3 of those purchases to the exact same address? Did 3 of those actually get returned at some point?
Right.
And are there more on order for that same address? Is that address overseas, or is it controlled by a payment solution that's overseas?
Huh.
These are the types of things that you could suggest to Amazon, but likely the first line of defense is you filing a case, that person doing all that digging. Really, what they're going to do is just verify that this was a purchase. The review itself does not say anything offensive, and they're likely going to say, "We looked into it, thank you,"
Right.
or something to that effect. If you keep getting more, or it seems to ramp up or get worse after that first complaint, that's when I would suggest that you get someone else involved. And that's where I'm saying, and whether that someone else is actually hiring, a consultant or an agency of some kind, or just asking around of other sellers and finding someone else who went through this. And I'm sure
Right. How did you navigate through this type of thing?
if
Yeah.
you ask 10 sellers that I'm sure someone has gone through something, sort of similar to this. We had a product that, someone, said was counterfeit. We know it's not counterfeit, it's our own product. And we had to
Right.
prove it to Amazon. And then Amazon was still giving us crap that it was because somebody complained about it. These are the types of things that go on. Bad actors know what buttons press Amazon. They can write a review that uses certain words, duplicate, copy, fake, not real. Those are the words that flag a manual review. I know that. If I know it, then I know that that's somebody else can know it. And boom, as soon as that somebody else knows that, they can have your items flagged. It's not that hard. So if you're seeing that sort of activity, well, it's 1 or 2. It's worth it to you to actually still put in a case and just get, Amazon anytime you escalate something, even if I'm escalating, I'm always going to ask you, what are the cases that you filed? And if you tell me you haven't filed a case, I'm probably not even going to take your case. In other words, I can't help you until you have complained formally within Amazon, and I've seen what Amazon's response is.
You've got a paper trail to at least start the
process.
process.
Need a paper trail to start, because I'm going to have it forwarded to somebody else. Depends on the type of problem, product complaint, whatever it is. I can help with that. Although to be clear, I can't guarantee anything. I can't guarantee an Amazon answer on anything. I make that very clear to anybody I can business with. But I can likely get you a response. It may not be the response you like. I could likely get you an escalation path. That may not be pleasant. You may not want to go through all of that. I can likely, find a press or something, if you really want to go down that path, or a legal option. Obviously, you want to try to avoid those the sort of we're at the last minute here, and we're gonna Amazon's gonna already shut you down. They've already denied your claim, and you've escalated, say, to a VP level, and you've still been denied. Well, at that point, you're pretty much at the press or legal stage, if you so choose. Typically I haven't had to do that, but it's happened.
Okay, so those are options potentially. Got it.
Yes.
Now, one of the debates that's been out there is like, if you don't get the answer you want right away, just email jeff@amazon.com. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm pretty negative on that. I mean, I won't. You know, unless you can answer, this is happening to, I'm sure, thousands of other customers just like me, or thousands of other sellers just like me, and somehow it hasn't hit the press yet. Somehow there hasn't been a legal class action yet. Unless you can come up with, I mean, I've had examples of the type of thing that Jeff might respond to, quickly, meaning the question mark email internally, is
Which we'll talk
something
about here in a
that,
second.
yeah, is something that this could easily have happened, or at least on the surface of, I'm Jeff, I'm reading an email and I look at this, and this seemingly could happen to anyone. Then you're going to get a question mark on down. And
Describe that process, just so everybody understands the background of what happens sometimes with the email to Jeff at. We think he's not actually reading it, but it's still his inbox, right?
Yeah, well, he has a team that reads them, and
Sure.
they're if you get an email from the team, you still have to respond. But if it's not the question mark, you have time. Time meaning, several days. Maybe 3 to 5 days, business days. You might need to provide updates if you're smart. I wouldn't just ignore the email for 3 to 5 days. And
You're talking about internally. So if you got forwarded this email that came from the internal team.
That's right. Now, if I received a question mark, which would not be,
which is literally just an email forwarded with a question mark. That's the entire body of the email, question mark.
Yes.
Like, how did this happen type of shorthand?
It's really saying, yes, how did this happen? What are we doing about it? And as of when are we solving this problem? Because you could recognize that, likely what you're receiving. I've received a couple. One was tied to a return in footwear, where the person took a picture of the box that they just opened. We're taking them at their word for it. They literally just showed, and the box of shoes was fairly decent, expensive, shoes that were clearly worn, and they were not new. So obviously we had taken a return and put something back in to be sold as new that was not new. And a question mark went on down. You could say to Wilkie and then to my boss, and who sent it to me. The other people may have added more than just the question mark, but it's more likely. On those, you kind of have 24 hours to solve the problem. And yes, so,
you mean solve the problem, not we'll start looking into it, but like you have to come up with a plan.
Oh, no, you should be looking into it by the time you're done reading the email.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the idea would be is that your date has changed.
You just stop everything, cancel my appointments. I got to deal with this.
Yes. Now, to the original question of saying, so why not just do that? If that's what's going to happen internally, that's sort of your goal.
Yeah, just cut through everything.
If I had to make it, look, I'm clearly not Jeff, and I clearly don't know his inbox or whatever, but I'll just make a guess, a random guess of less than 0.1% of emails he receives, or Jassy now, gets the equivalent of a question mark, And so what I would argue is the team is handling not just the vast majority, predominant majority of what comes in. And if this is a sort of, you're reading this email, it comes across as a threat, it's pretty much going to get ignored. If reading through it, the person sounds genuinely concerned about your customer experience, and this appears to be broader than this one customer. Clearly in this particular example where I said this person received, I was horrified. I mean, I ran the shoe category. I was horrified that,
Yeah.
how did this happen? And, unfortunately, it is tied to manual. We have a returns person opens the box. They looked at it. The person who had done this one had worked there 6 years, impeccable record. I don't know if she had a bad day or whatever. And yes, I happen to know it was female, but like, I don't know. And nothing ended up happening to that individual. Nothing ended up happening to me. We did have to write through a fairly, I don't know, 3 to 4 page document of the process of what a shoe goes through when it's going through the return center. How could we, fix this going forward? Is there a different check system that this person who's opening the box and the different checks they're supposed to go through? We didn't actually end up changing a ton. We did add a couple more boxes to that check system of what they have to go through. We didn't change anything of if the initial check is yes, can be sold as new. Okay, what do we need to do to the item to make it be sold as new? Other than, shouldn't someone else, once it was said sold as new and they're looking at it, the person who's actually working on it, could we have a 2-person check? And so that was part of this process. Is we're going to take a look at whether that's going to help the process more. So we will go through all that. Again, back to the original. Most do not get the question mark. Most will be funneled down to the category leader almost immediately. And the category leader, I will just tell you, if it's coming across as a threat, or I can't believe you haven't paid attention to me as a seller, it's going to get ignored.
Right.
You just sound like bad apples, rotten day. And where I would say you're better served is an escalation path of the people that are actually going to implement whatever change you're talking about. If you're talking about a product compliance issue, no, if you think Jeff or Jassy has anything to do with which products have to do what types of product compliance tests, they don't know.
Right.
They're gonna. So it'll go over to the product compliance team anyway. So I would say you're better off finding, if you happen to know, but most people don't, a senior manager or director in the product compliance team, explaining to them why this is not just a one-off problem, explaining to them why this would appear as though we're being singled out, but your private label doesn't seem to be going through the same process. And here's the data that's proving that, or here's the process that's proving that. Can shouldn't this be revisited? Without saying, oh, I'm going to take this to legal or the New York Times tomorrow.
Yeah. When you make threats.
Well, unless you really are going to do that, you
Right.
might want to give them a forewarning. But I would say I would give Amazon the ability to solve the problem first. And doing the nuclear option of going directly to Jassy or Jeff, I would say is not nearly as successful as people think it is.
Good advice. Good advice. So this has been an interesting discussion on the inner workings of Amazon, what happens behind the scenes, how did Amazon's mentality get them to where they are, and kind of how to navigate things behind the scenes. So if somebody wanted to learn more from you, where would they go?
Oh, I'm on LinkedIn, or you can certainly send me an email at friedlanderstan@gmail.com. So my last name and first name, no space, no period, @gmail.com. That's the best way.
Okay, good deal. And we'll have links to your LinkedIn down below. And we will also describe your email address in the link down below, or we won't actually put the actual email address. It'll be like @at dot I'm sure people that want to get a hold of you will figure it out. And
Yeah,
that'll also be in the show notes as well for those listening to the audio version of this podcast. So, Stan, thank you very much for coming on and being very generous with some really interesting knowledge. It really has me thinking about the process, what I'm controlling in things, uh, ways of navigating with Amazon. So, this has really been a great discussion. So, I appreciate it.
no worries. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.